Last spring, a woman in Ohio sent me a photo of her garden. She hadn't planted anything in 4 years. It was full. Asparagus coming up in the same corner it always does. Artichokes taller than her fence. Rhubarb so thick she'd been giving it away to neighbors for 3 years straight. Herbs she'd forgotten she'd even planted, coming back like nothing had happened. She didn't do anything. She just didn't stop them. There's a category of vegetable that the seed industry doesn't talk about much. Not because they're rare, because they're too good a deal. You plant them once and they come back every year on their own. Some of them for decades. Some of them for the rest of your life. 19 of them. Here's what they are. They're called perennials. Most vegetables you've ever grown are annuals. They live one season, produce, and die. You buy seed every year. That's the model. That's the business. Perennial vegetables work differently. They put down deep root systems in year 1, go dormant in winter, and come back in spring stronger than the year before. Some of them don't even hit their peak production until year 3 or 4. And then they just keep going. Most of these cost less than $10 to start. After that, they're free every year for the rest of your life. 19 of them. This isn't a new idea. It's an old one that got inconvenient. Before industrial agriculture standardized the annual seed cycle, most kitchen gardens were built around perennial crops. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder documented asparagus cultivation in 77 CE and noted that established beds could produce for decades without replanting. The same beds, the same roots. In medieval Europe, the cottage garden wasn't replanted every spring. It was managed. Herbs, roots, climbing, vegetables. Most of them coming back on their own, year after year from the same crowns and root systems. The Cherokee, Haudenosaunee, and dozens of other North American indigenous nations cultivated perennial food systems for centuries before the European contact. Groundnut, Jerusalem artichoke, ramps, plants that required almost no intervention and fed people reliably through harsh winters and dry summers. The shift to annual crops happened because annuals are easier to standardize, easier to sell, and easier to control. A perennial garden feeds itself. An annual garden feeds the seed company first. Here's why they disappeared from most modern gardens. And again, it's not a conspiracy, it's just economics. Annual vegetables are bred for one season of maximum production. They're fast. They're predictable. They fit neatly into the model of buying new seed every spring, preparing a bed, planting, harvesting, and starting over. Perennial vegetables are slower. Most of them ask you to wait. Asparagus takes 3 years before you get a full harvest. Artichokes won't show their best until year 2. That patience is a hard sell at a garden center, so they got pushed to the edges. Specialty catalogs, old family gardens, the back corner of the property that nobody touched for 40 years, they didn't fail. They just stopped being convenient to sell, and that's the gap. Because inconvenient to sell is not the same thing as inconvenient to grow. Once they're established, most of these plants are the lowest maintenance food you will ever produce. You've seen this work without knowing it. Think about the chives that keep coming up in the same spot every spring no matter what. The mint that escaped its pot 3 years ago and now grows in the crack between the patio and the fence. The horseradish in the back corner that nobody planted. It just appeared 1 year and has been there ever since. That's not a weed problem. That's a perennial doing exactly what perennials do. The difference between those plants and the 19 on this list is that someone decided these ones were worth eating. Here's what makes perennial vegetables different from everything else in your garden, and why understanding it changes how you plan a food system. An annual plant puts almost all of its energy into reproduction. It grows fast, flowers fast, sets seed fast, and dies. That's the entire strategy. One season, maximum output, then gone. A perennial plant plays a longer game. In year 1, it puts most of its energy underground, building roots, building storage, building the infrastructure it will live on for the next decade. The above ground growth in year 1 is almost beside the point. In year 2, it starts to produce. In year 3, it hits its stride. And from there, the root system is so established, so deep, so wide, so connected to the soil biology around it, that drought, frost, poor soil, neglect, none of it kills it. It just goes dormant and comes back. This is why a 30-year-old asparagus bed produces more than a new one. The root system is enormous. It has spent 3 decades building exactly one thing: the capacity to feed you every spring without being asked. No annual can do that. It doesn't have time. If you found this useful so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. It goes a long way to support the channel. Here they are, 19 vegetables that grow back every year. Asparagus. The long game of the perennial garden. Takes 3 years to establish. If in year 1 and 2 you let it grow without harvesting, building the root system. From year 3 onward, a well-established bed produces for 20 to 30 years from the same crowns. Plant in deep, well-drained soil. Full sun. Once it's in, leave the roots alone. Artichoke. Dramatic, productive, and almost entirely self-sufficient after year 1. Produces large edible flower heads from spring through early summer. In mild climates, it's fully evergreen. In cold climates, mulch the crown in late fall and it comes back in spring. One plant can produce a dozen or more heads per season at peak. Rhubarb. one of the most cold-hardy perennials on this list. Plant the crown once, and a healthy rhubarb plant will outlive you. Produces stalks every spring without any intervention. Only rule, never eat the leaves. They're toxic. The stalks are the crop. Divide the crown every 5 to 7 years to keep production strong. For perennial starts and crowns, I'll link the suppliers I actually use in the description. Most are under $10 per crown and you only buy them once. Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke. Native to North America, cultivated by indigenous nations for centuries. Produces edible tubers underground. Nutty, slightly sweet, high in inulin. Grows in almost any soil, including poor and rocky ground that would kill most vegetables. Spreads aggressively. Plant it where you want it to stay, because it will stay. Sorrel, a leafy perennial with a bright, lemony flavor that comes back earlier in spring than almost anything else in the garden. Grows in partial shade. Drought tolerant once established. Cut it back hard in midsummer and it pushes new growth through fall. One plant keeps producing for a decade or more. To propagate, divide the root clump every 3 to 4 years in early spring. Each division becomes a new plant. You never buy seed again. Lovage. Tastes like celery, grows like a weed, comes back every year without being asked, can reach 6 feet tall. Every part is edible. Leaves, stems, seeds. One plant in the right spot will supply more celery-flavored greens than most households can use, largely forgotten in modern gardens. Completely undeserved. Ramps, wild leek, native to eastern North America. Woodland perennial, grows in shade, which means it occupies garden space that nothing else can use. Strong garlic onion flavor, comes up in early spring before most other food is available, which makes it genuinely useful rather than just interesting. Slow to establish from seed, buy starts if possible. Once established, spreads slowly on its own. Egyptian walking onion produces clusters of small bulblets at the top of its stalks. When they get heavy enough, the stalk bends and the bulblets touch the ground and root, hence the name. Completely self-propagating. Plant it once and it walks itself across a bed, producing new onions every year with no intervention. Hardy to extreme cold. One of the most genuinely self-sufficient plants on this list. To save and propagate, just let it walk, or collect the top bulblets and plant them wherever you want more. Chives. Already in most gardens and already perennial, most people just don't think of them as a food crop. Onion chives and garlic chives both come back every year, spread slowly by seed and produce continuously through the growing season. Cut them to the ground and they regrow. Divide the clump every few years and you have more plants than you know what to do with. Horseradish, almost impossible to kill once established. Produces large, pungent roots that can be harvested anytime the ground isn't frozen. Spreads from root fragments. If you leave any piece of root in the ground, it comes back. Plant it in a contained area unless you want it everywhere, which if you use horseradish, you might. Good King Henry, a perennial green that was a staple of European cottage gardens for centuries and has almost completely vanished from modern cultivation. Young shoots are eaten like asparagus in spring, leaves like spinach through summer. Hardy, shade-tolerant, self-seeding. One of the most nutritious plants on this list and one of the least known. Sea kale, maritime perennial. Bred from wild plants growing on the rocky coastlines of Europe. Produces blanched shoots in early spring, tender, slightly nutty, eaten like asparagus. Extremely drought tolerant once established. Deep taproot reaches water that surface crops can't find. Hardy to well below freezing. Ostrich fern produces fiddleheads, the young, tightly coiled fronds, in early spring. Woodland plant thrives in shade and moist soil, native to northeastern North America, harvested for centuries by indigenous communities. One of the few truly shade-productive food plants on this list, it occupies space nothing else will grow in. Groundnut, Apios americana, nitrogen-fixing perennial vine that produces edible tubers underground and edible beans above, cultivated by indigenous nations across eastern North America for thousands of years before European contact. Grows in poor, wet soil, largely abandoned after the introduction of the potato. Currently being researched as a food security crop, one of the most nutritionally complete plants on this list. Turkish rocket, perennial relative of arugula with a stronger, more complex flavor. Produces edible leaves from early spring through late fall. Drought tolerant, self-seeding, comes back harder every year. Largely unknown outside specialty growing circles. Exactly the kind of plant this list exists to surface. Scorzonera, black-skinned, root vegetable. Cultivated in Europe since the 16th century. Grows like a parsnip but is fully perennial. Leave the roots in the ground and they keep growing year after year, getting larger and more productive. Mild, slightly sweet flavor. Completely disappeared from mainstream seed catalogs. Still available from specialty heirloom suppliers. Watercress. Perennial aquatic plant that grows in any consistently moist environment. The edge of a pond, a slow stream, a container kept wet. Produces peppery greens continuously through the growing season and into winter in mild climates. Cut and it regrows. One of the most nutrient-dense plants on this list. Needs no soil amendment, no fertilizer, no intervention, just water. Skirret, root vegetable cultivated in Europe and Asia since antiquity. Sweet, parsnip-like roots produced in clusters. Fully perennial, divide the crown each year and you have more plants. Largely forgotten after the potato arrived in Europe and replaced most root vegetable cultivation, being rediscovered by food security researchers for its resilience and yield in poor soils. Walking leek, perennial leek that self-propagates by producing small bulblets at the base of the plant. Milder than Egyptian walking onion, closer in flavor to a standard leek. Hardy through winter, spreads slowly but reliably. One of the least demanding alliums you can grow and one of the most consistently productive. Here's what most people get wrong when they first try perennial vegetables. Mistake 1, harvesting too early. The most common mistake with asparagus, artichoke, and most root perennials is impatience. The plant needs its first season, sometimes its first 2 seasons, to build root mass. If you harvest heavily in year 1, you weaken the root system and it takes years to recover. Wait, the payoff is permanent production. One bad season of patience now is worth 30 years of harvest later. Mistake 2, planting them in annual bed rotation. Perennial vegetables need a permanent home. If you're rotating annual crops through your beds each year, which is good practice for annuals, your perennials cannot be in that system. Give them their own dedicated space. A perennial bed that doesn't get dug up, rotated, or disturbed. They reward permanence. Mistake 3, underestimating spread. Jerusalem artichoke, horseradish, Egyptian walking onion. Several plants on this list will take over if you let them. Not a problem if you plan for it. A serious problem if you plant them in the middle of your main garden bed and come back in 3 years. Plant aggressive spreaders in contained spaces, raised beds, or areas where expansion is welcome. Here's what this looks like at scale. A dedicated perennial bed, 8 feet by 20 feet, planted with a mix from this list, produces food from February through November in most temperate climates. Ramps and sorrel in early spring before anything else is ready. Asparagus and artichoke through late spring. Lovage, chives, Turkish rocket through summer. Jerusalem artichoke and scorsonera roots through fall and into winter. That same bed, once established, requires almost no annual input. No tilling, no replanting, no seed buying. The main work is dividing crowns every few years and keeping aggressive spreaders in check. A family of 4 spending $800 a year on fresh vegetables can replace a significant portion of that with one well-planned, perennial bed, established for under $200 in starts and crowns, producing indefinitely from the second year onward. After year 1, the math stops working in the seed company's favor and starts working in yours. 2 concerns come up every time. I don't have space for a dedicated perennial bed. Most of the plants on this list grow vertically, in containers, in shade, or in spaces annual crops can't use. Ramps and ostrich fern in shaded corners, watercress in a container kept moist, Egyptian walking onion in a narrow border, chives in a pot on a balcony. You don't need a dedicated bed. You need unused space, and most gardens have more of it than they think. What if I move? A fair concern. The answer is, plant the short establishment ones first. Chives, sorrel, lovage, Egyptian walking onion, all producing meaningfully in year 1. Save the long game plants like asparagus for when you're more certain of where you're staying. And if you do move, rhubarb, sorrel, and most root perennials transplant well. You take them with you. 2 more examples from history. Different civilizations, same principle. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, maintained food systems built significantly around perennial crops for centuries across what is now the northeastern United States and Canada. Their gardens were not replanted from scratch each year. They were managed, tended, allowed to develop over decades into increasingly productive ecosystems. In medieval Japan, the Sadayama landscape, the managed woodland edge between village and forest, was a perennial food system. Bamboo shoots, wild vegetables, root crops, all of them coming back each year from established root systems, all of them requiring management rather than replanting. Both systems fed people reliably across generations. Neither required buying seed every spring. The knowledge didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it couldn't be packaged and sold the same way. Here's the thing about a perennial garden. It doesn't ask much of you in the long run. It asks a lot in year 1, the planning, the soil preparation, the patience to not harvest when you want to. And then it asks almost nothing. It just feeds you, year after year, from the same roots, without being replanted, without being bought again. There's something quietly extraordinary about that. A plant that has already done the hard work, that has already built the infrastructure, that has already figured out your soil, your climate, your microclimate, and then decided to stay. You didn't have to earn that, you just had to let it happen. If this changes how you think about what goes in the ground this spring, the next video is going to take it further, because a perennial garden solves the replanting problem. But there's a second problem most people don't think about until it's too late: water. Specifically in how farms and homesteads supplied reliable water for decades before any infrastructure existed. Some of those systems cost nothing to build. Some of them are still running. If you found this useful, please subscribe and hit the like button. It goes a long way to support the channel. That's next. I'll see you there. Everything I use to source perennial starts and crowns is linked in the description. Most of it you buy once. That's the whole point.